should prisons be abolished more or less? And I think the prison system as it is such a failure and has been for 100 years. It's time to move on and change things.
Sometimes we've become as a country, we're quite addicted to prison as the solution to crime.
Women's centres do incredible work, and unfortunately they're underutilised.
But part of the idea of decarceration is justice. We as a society don't really agree or understand what we mean by justice when we say justice.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this Tortoise ThinkIn. Excitingly for me, if you look over my shoulder, you'll see a little tortoise. I'm actually in our newsroom. It's the first time I've been in our newsroom since March. And when I came in this morning, we've got a blackboard over in the corner where we would write up the list of stories we were going to do for a week. And it completely stopped me in my tracks because it was for somewhere in about mid-March. And it felt like I was sort of diving on a shipwreck or something. It was just such a weird experience to come back in here. But it's great to be back, and I'm really delighted that you've all joined us tonight. What's on our mind this evening? We're considering the issue of a world without prisons, and we're going to ask the question, is there a case for decarceration? Or to put it another way, should we stop locking people up? What I would say to you is I think you should clear some space and warn your neighbours, because by the end, I think you're going to want to stand up and shout, because there's a lot of injustice in play in this sphere. And it's going to be, I hope, a gripping session. I've been feeling very inspired by Congressman John Lewis, who died last month, and revisiting some of his speeches, and this mantra that he had about activism, which was really along the lines of, if you see injustice, say something, get in the way, cause trouble, cause good trouble. And that's the sort of clarion call for me tonight. How do we cause good trouble in this area? Because I'm certain that there is an injustice going on in our prison system, and I just want to know how we get there, what the story is that we're going to tell. So I'm hoping that a lot of good voices tonight are going to get us there. So just before we get stuck in, let me do some Zoom etiquette. You must have done this a billion times by now, but just to let you know, it's automatically muted, but you can still have your say. If you go to the participants button at the bottom of your screen, you can see a little thing that that allows you to raise your hand, and if you want to do that, that's that you can put your little blue hand up, and that's going to show us that you're keen to take part. And equally, you're probably familiar with the chat. My colleague Claudia is running things over there. There she is. Hey, Claudia. And over there, more often than not, that's where the really good stuff happens. People share their views, and Claudia will no doubt give me a nudge if somebody's saying something that we should kind of bring into this bit of the service. So if you want to try those little blue hands, can I just ask, just as a sample question, hands up if you've ever been inside a prison. And I can see at least a dozen going up there. There's some obviously very good citizens here. Leave your hand up if if they made you stay. Well, there you go. So I mean, there's only, in fact, my next door neighbour belatedly put her hand down there. All right, I was just reflecting on that question myself today, and remembering that I've been to some quite forbidding Victorian prisons like Durham and Pentonville and Wormwood Scrubs and Portland Young Offenders, and some really forbidding modern prisons like Frankland and Feltham. I suppose the collector's item for me was I went to Guantanamo Bay, and I went inside Camp 6 there, which is one of those supermax prisons where they hold some of the detainees, and it's a truly surreal experience. But none of them felt like welcoming places. None of them felt like an episode of Porridge or an episode of Orange is the New Black. there's clearly a culture there which is forbidding in the extreme, and a lot of people in there, as I think we're going to find out tonight, who have backstories which aren't just about criminal offences. So we've got a bunch of really good voices with us tonight. I just want to shout them out first. We've got Vicky Cardwell, who's the CEO of Spark Inside. Hi, Vicky. Joining us from Coventry today. And again, we'll get into it, but I know that your work is predominantly inside prisons, coaching and working with young male offenders, I think I'm right in saying, for the most part. We've got Summers Gerson, who's joining us, who's from The View magazine. Hey, Summers, how are you doing? The View magazine, which has the immortal strapline for women of conviction, and I think that tells you something about it. It's written by and for women who are in prison. And again, has an activist slant to it, but also a cultural one. And then Francis Crook is with us, who I'm sure many of you know is Chief Executive of the Howard League for Penal Reform. I've worked with Francis a lot over the years, and she's been a strong voice in this area for quite some time, let's say that. And if you don't mind, Francis, I might just start with you. I know that over the past few years, you've been involved in a lot of legal actions, fighting fights over issues like isolation, inadequate access to education, the treatment of women, legal cuts in legal aid, all of which have moved the dial, I think. But it seems like a remiss thing not to start with COVID-19 tonight, because I think we've all seen the impact in every imaginable walk of life, but I don't think very much has been discussed about what's been happening in prisons. And I'd really like just to hear from you what you've heard and what we should be concerned about.
Well, when we all locked down, prisons were locked down too. But of course, it's a completely different experience if you're two people locked in a cell in Pentonville or Leeds or Manchester, in a Victorian cell the size of a small toilet, indeed with a toilet in it. You'd be lucky if you've got running water. You may get a shower every day if you're lucky. A lot of prisoners weren't getting exercise, weren't getting anything at all for weeks on end. Now, what was surprising, I think, to everybody was the compliance that prisoners gave to this regime, because it was really grim. Mm-hmm. But I think it turned out to be actually the explanation for the compliance by prisoners was because previously, when they'd been out on the landings and doing things, prisons were so frightening and so dangerous and so awful and so badly run and so unsympathetic in every way that people actually would prefer to be locked up with nothing to do in a tiny fetid cell. And that is the most appalling indictment of our prison system, that people would prefer that to being able to walk around outside in the prison itself. So your question that we're going to be discussing is, should prisons be abolished more or less? And I think the prison system as it is such a failure and has been for 100 years. It's time to move on and change things. That doesn't mean that people who are really dangerous and have done horrible things shouldn't be taken out of society. I think they should, but they should be treated properly, because almost all of them are going to come back at one time or another. So abolishing prisons as they are is something I would certainly consider, and particularly for women, because you mentioned women. But the prisons have just been absolutely awful, and they create more crime. More people commit crimes when they come out. The majority of people do. So it's an abject failure of a policy. Total.
And can I just ask, have you been involved in any legal actions during lockdown?
Well, we threatened legal action because the government originally said that they were going to release a lot of people in order to create what they called headroom. But in fact, they didn't. They hardly released anybody under the special measures. Whereas in France, thousands of people were released, and even in America and countries across the world, because of the prisons are very like care homes. They are enclosed environments, and the possibility for transmitting the disease, COVID, was very frightening. In the end, because of the lockdown and the measures that were taken, actually it didn't spread as virulently as was expected. But we did threaten legal action, and I think because of that, some people were released, not many, and new measures are being introduced slowly now, which is good. But you know, we're a small organisation. We do what we can. We rattle the bars, literally. It's what we do.
Yes. Right. Okay. Well, let that be our early call to action, to rattle the bars tonight. Let's go to Summers. And again, I think you were just, please do it again. You were just holding up before we came on your new edition of The View.
Yes, we have it right here. Summer 2020.
It's a fabulous cover.
It is. We had, this spring, we had a benefit auction called Incarceration Nation. And this is one of the works that was actually purchased by the National Justice Museum for their collection.
And was that done by a serving prisoner?
No, it wasn't. But part of our kind of ethos of inclusion is to also promote art by women prisoners, along with, you know, well-known contemporary artists, to kind of show that, you know, that they are equal standing, you know, and have just as valid voice and opinions.
Can I ask you the same question? What have you picked up? I can see you have a strapline on the cover there about COVID-19. What have you picked up during lockdown about conditions? You're focused on women, I know. Yeah.
So we've heard, and we are in a special, I guess, position where we hear directly from women because they write and produce the magazine for us. And we've heard, you know, that there are a lot of women who felt very afraid during lockdown because communication wasn't open. You know, they didn't know what was going on. They were being locked up in their cells for 23 hours a day. Yeah. Like Frances said, nothing to do. You know, they weren't being given even, you know, books to read. And, you know, things like soap and hand sanitizer weren't being distributed freely. You needed to purchase them.
Wow, you're kidding? Yeah.
No, yeah.
Hand sanitizer.
Yeah, so that, you know, they're hearing stories of what's going on in the world, and they're not able to employ these basic measures in their own lives. And, you know, things like social distancing are physically impossible when cells, you know, you can't be 2 meters away from anybody at any time. Things like getting fresh air and exercising were limited almost entirely.
And can I just ask as well, what about visits? I mean, I take it as read they just ended, but was anyone able to make contact with their family?
No, all visits were complete, and they still are. Now they're kind of starting to readdress on a case-by-case basis, reopening prisons to family members and visitors, but otherwise, you know, complete isolation. And, you know, it just, when you hear about what's going on in the world, when you are kind of completely shut off, you know, there's a lot of fear that they'd been forgotten, that, you know, because they'd been convicted of a crime, that society said, you know what, it's fine, you know, we can, you're expendable. And, you know, the reality is most of these women are in prison for very short sentences, most 80% less than a year for nonviolent offenses. So, you know, it's traumatic to think you know, you made one mistake and now all of a sudden society has written you off to a global pandemic.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much for sharing that. And Vicky, just give us again, rather than me say it, why don't you just tell us a little bit about the work that you do as an organisation, and again how you've what you've bumped up against during lockdown.
Well, we, so Spark Inside coaches young men in prisons. That's young men aged 15 to 25. So, you know, boys and young men. And I just want to touch on the COVID-19. It was the same for children in prison as well. So these are sort of 15, 16, 17-year-old boys who, when lockdown happened, you know, that was it. There were no visits from family. There was no rehabilitation services, face-to-face education stopped. And a part of me thinks if this was any other group of young people in society, there'd be much more press attention about it. But it just kind of happened. And really, you know, this group can't be sort of out of sight, out of mind. I mean, things are starting to open up now, which is really good. For young people, you know, 3 months can feel a lot longer as well. So it's been really, really tough for, you know, all people in prison, but, you know, particularly because we work with young people, I'm going to talk about them. It's been really, really tough. And, you know, they've dealt with it extremely well, but our point is it's not sustainable. This isn't sustainable for young people in prison.
What's at the best of times, what's the education provision like for those teenagers? So
every prison does have a regime, and the young people will come out of their cell and go to education. The reality is, because there's high levels of violence in prisons, and, you know, very high levels of self-harm, you know, 1% of children in England are in the care system. It's 2/5 of young people in prison have been in care. So there's high levels of vulnerability. There's also a lot of skill and a lot of strength. So there's a lot, you know, we're called Spark Inside because we think every single young person's got a spark and something special, but you can't get away from the fact that there's a lot of vulnerability. So because of the environment, you know, you can have great facilities, great workshops, but young people aren't always getting to them. So they're not always allowed out of their cell to go to workshops and to go to education. So, yeah, that's the reality of how COVID-19 has been for young people in prison.
Well, thank you for setting the scene a little bit there as well. And just to remind you all, if you want to raise your little blue hand, that's going to be a slap around the head for me to say that you'd like to speak. So do that. And again, I'm just going to say to my colleague Claudia, if there's anyone you think I should come to, then please just ping me a message, won't you? I just wanted to, before we start throwing it open, I can see that in the chat there's already, you know, the kind of discussion going on about how as a society you balance, you know, your right to, you know, call for punishment, the entitlement of victims to have a measure of justice, set against the, you know, the absolute sort of duty and need of a society to rehabilitate its offenders. You know, there's not very much point in just spending a lot of money taking people out of circulation if you don't do anything to change the way they behave. But it's clear that there are already people who are wrestling with some of that stuff. Why don't I come to, you know, never backwards and coming forwards, William Jeremy, who's got his blue hand up, and always a great voice to get our discussion going. So William, I think you're on mute, but
Hi,
how's it going?
Hi, Vicky. What I wanted to ask was some years ago, in fact, I say some years ago, it's probably 20 now, I was involved in South Wales with the rolling out of the community mediation young offending team, where we would put youngsters who'd done stupid things like, you know, damaged cars and stolen things and been in trouble of one sort or another, together with their victims, as it were, for mediation sessions. And okay, it was a low-level operation because it was a bit of an experiment, and I wondered what the whole notion of mediation on a wider scale, where that was now.
Francis, do you want to grab that? I should have said, of course. I mean, the golden rule of Thinkins is no questions.
Oh yeah, sorry.
I'm going to let it pass.
That was more an observation as a question. I'm sorry.
Let's pretend it was an observation and pass the baton to Francis.
Yeah, I mean, restorative justice is rolled out across the system. It's very interesting because it's the most researched part of the justice system. And there's a lot of research on restorative justice, or restorative solutions, I prefer to call it. And it's very effective. And interestingly, it's most effective in the most serious crimes. So there's some really interesting work done by various voluntary organisations with victims who've been experienced really quite distressing violence with the offender. And it seems to, it's the only thing that victims have confidence in. You look at the criminal justice system, victims don't like any of it. It treats victims, it's very exploitative, and it treats victims very badly. But restorative justice, restorative solutions, engages with victims in a respectful way and deals with their pain and their anxiety and their misery and their anger, justifiable anger, and assuages it to a large extent. It's the only part of the justice system that works. The trouble is that it's added on to punishment. And I think that's wrong. It's a completely different way of dealing with antisocial behaviour and crime. And I think we should see it as the future of something. We've had punishment like this for 2,000 years. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. We've had a system which is proportionate revenge, which is what our criminal justice system is. You do something, we'll hurt you, you've hurt people. And restorative solutions is a completely different way of looking at resolving pain and trying to make things better instead of making things worse, which is what we do.
Could you give me an example of something that you've seen which has inspired you and that you think works?
Well, the thing is, it's a process, it's not a thing. So it's quite difficult to see it because it's about conversation and it's about a journey that people take. So they have you need a very skilled mediator. As William said, you need a very skilled mediator and it's a journey that it's conversations, it's talking to people, it's listening. It can result in some action. So, for example, you can get someone, if it's a young person, you can get them to paint the fence or mend the window or something. That's not really the point. The point is it's about listening to pain and anger and dealing with it. It's a conversation, it's a process. So it is completely different to something happening, which is what happens at the moment.
Yes, very interesting. Thank you. So I wouldn't mind coming to Jennifer Allerton if she's around, because in the chat, Jennifer says, "Hey there, how are you doing?"
Hello, can you hear me?
I can hear you. And what caught my eye in the chat was that you're currently writing an application for a job as a library assistant at a prison. Whereabouts are you?
I'm currently based in Bradford-on-Avon, but the prison is elsewhere. There isn't one that close.
What caught your eye about it? And you say you've read through the inspection report. What did you learn?
Yeah, well, I was reading through it mostly to sort of find out a little bit about, because I knew it was it's a category B adult men's prison, and I thought, okay, I should read a little bit about the safety of the prison, and if I'm going to go work there, how comfortable would I feel, but also things about it was a library assistant job, and it said they have a good library but not very good access to it. I think that
for looking after themselves then.
Yeah, so there's limited access to education and things.
Can I ask what led you in that direction? It's not for everyone, I suppose, is it?
No, I've been struggling with my job recently, and being autistic, one of the things I quite like is the kind of work that other people aren't so keen on, which is having the same routine every day and tight structure in place that helps me. And weirdly, a prison is one of the things where you get that a lot of routine and a lot of structure. But yeah, it's finding out the other things about it that I wanted to know. And I have a strong interest in prison reform anyway, and the ways that it works or doesn't work at the moment. and ways that it could be improved. So it would be interesting to see from the inside.
Absolutely. Well, I tell you what, it seems like an opportune moment to go back to Vicky, because this is your area of specialism, isn't it? Dealing with young men in the prison system. What work is being done inside to try and reform people, to rehabilitate them so that they lead purposeful lives?
I mean, what I would say is there are a lot of good people who work in the system. So there are brilliant prison officers, there are brilliant young people in prison who want to turn their lives around. To be honest, pretty much every young person wants to come out and do something different with their life. Yeah. That's their sort of strong motivation. And there are good charities and organisations that want to get in. I guess I don't want to sound too negative, but the system is broken. Yeah. So it is very difficult to do good work in prison because of, like I talked about, the violence, the levels of self-harm, the kind of the vulnerabilities in there. So I think the point I'd want to make to the big question is, some young people will need to be in a secure place where they can't harm others or harm themselves. But actually, for so many, there are other solutions. And I think the reparation that Francis was talking about, the chance to repair the harm, the chance to put right, make amends for something that they've done. But also when, once young people come out of prison, they've got an uphill battle to get a job, to get back on track with their education. So we've actually, for a lot of young people, we've made it worse, or we've made it harder for them to move away from crime. And that's good for all of us if young people can find a path, can find a way through, and so many of them want to. So I think, yes, there's good work in prison, but there's the system itself is a really difficult one. And
So Francis began by saying, it's been a disaster for a century. And you've just described the system as being broken. Is there a moment in time that you point to where it starts to either get overloaded or underfunded or what?
I mean, what I'd say is sometimes we've become as a country, we're quite addicted to prison as the solution to crime. Yes. Because we all understand it, we know what it is, we feel safe sending people there. But I would just say other countries have done things differently. So, Finland managed to reduce its prison population by 70%. There's some states in America like Connecticut just decided that they would reduce their prison population, and crime went down. So it didn't cause crime to rise. And actually, if you look at what happened there, what happened was people on different sides of the political fence decided that they would work together, and you put in the programs, you put in changes to sentencing. So I think, it's saying it can be done. Mm-hmm. There's some of it is about decisions and will, as well as about, instead of us just looking at the system and saying, well, this is how it always must be. And all of us want to keep people safe, and we all want to see crime go down. But let's think of ways that we can do it that work.
You're so right. I mean, there's almost no sort of field of human activity where if something is costing a lot of money and not having a good outcome, you persist with it and you're not willing to try other things. But as you say, it's a very good way of putting it, to say we seem to be addicted to prison. I don't think there's ever been a Home Secretary who's had to resign for being too tough and draconian. It's generally the other way around, isn't it? Just to put a little bit of context on the prison population, at the end of last year, almost 83,000 in prison in England and Wales, and that number had been falling for a bit for most of a decade, I suppose, but not by a great deal. We were still the most prolific jailer in Western Europe. There are figures that show for every 100,000 of us, we lock up 138 people in England and Wales, and in France it's like 104. In Germany it's about 79. So you can see in other large Western European countries they do things differently. And the thing that is so jarring is that you know, it wasn't always like this. A century ago, you know, there was about a quarter of the size of the prison population, and nearly all of this increase has happened since 1990, hasn't it? It's truly remarkable. And you can look back to, you know, that infamous speech that Michael Howard gave to a Tory party conference where he had, you know, the immortal buzz phrase that made all the headlines of "prison works," and he went on to say, you know, we're no longer going to judge the success of our justice system according to a reduction in the number of people who go to prison. Far from it. He was quite keen to send more. And you know, you like to think, and we're told that the criminal courts, you know, aren't influenced by this stuff. They act independently. But of course, if you're in an environment where tabloids are pushing for tougher, harder punishments, it creates an atmosphere, and you can see a clear indication that the prison population began going up at that time. So, you know, that's the recent context, really, that this is a thing. This addiction is a new addiction, isn't it? It's the last 30 years or so that we've talked ourselves into this. So if that's some context, I think I would love to just hear from a couple of other people who are engaged by whether or not we focus too much on punishment. And Dan McKee caught my eye in the chat. Dan, I don't know if I'm going to do this justice, but you, I think, are a self-described anarchist. I don't want to. I mean, you've got very organised bookshelves. That's all I would say.
Yeah, well, that is my book about anarchism. So I am an anarchist.
So that's the only one that's slightly askew. Everything else is perfectly ordered. So, you know, I think you need to look to your laurels there. But anyway, don't let me blow you off course. What do you?
Well, yeah, I mean, this has always interested me because, you know, I come from a philosophy background, and I sort of advocate anarchism on philosophical grounds as how society should be ordered, which might seem strange, but I don't want to go on an anarchist tangent. But part of the thing that you always get when you try and advocate anarchism is people say to you, what about crime? You know, how do we deal with criminals? So I've always been interested in the idea of alternative ways of dealing with crime. Mm-hmm. And I think, you know, to focus on this particular issue, and as a philosopher, the two things that sort of, I think, are part of the idea of decarceration is justice. We as a society don't really agree or understand what we mean by justice when we say justice. Yes. I don't think everyone has the same idea in mind, and yet, you know, prisons and our criminal justice system are there designed to mete out justice, and we believe prison is a way of doing this. And if we don't agree on what justice is, then that's part of the problem. So if you look at our system, it seems that a big part of the prison system is about justice coming as a form of revenge, you know, or retribution, or some sort of punishment where prisoners deserve something bad because of what they've done. So, you know, the COVID stuff we were talking about at the start, why do people not care about what's going on in the prisons? Because they deserve it there in prison. Why is there a lack of funding? Well, because we can't give too much funding to prisons because they don't deserve money. As soon as prisoners have, you know, any report of anything nice or good happening, people go, in the tabloids certainly, you know, can you believe what they're doing in prisons where people don't have stuff? They've been given money that, you know, other people could be given.
It's not only the tabloids, by the way. I mean, if you happen to be a prime minister with a column in the Daily Telegraph, you're also pretty much on that syndrome, aren't you?
And just on the street, you know, if you talk to people and they hear that, you know, there's such underfunding all over the place after, you know, 10 years of austerity. If they hear that prisoners got money, people in general feel, well, is that the best way to spend money? When in our head, the idea of justice in prisons, that we should be making prisoners pay for what they've done.
So what's your thinking in terms of where are you looking for solutions?
Well, I mean, I think it comes to this idea that we've been getting with a lot of the Black Lives Matter protests and, you know, throughout lots of places about defunding police. And I think the link we haven't really made at the moment is to the police and prisons and the idea of criminalisation, because as soon as you have someone in prison, you have an idea that they've committed a crime, you know, therefore they are bad. And so many things that people are committing as crimes or, you know, put into prison for short sentences, aren't particularly terrible things, aren't the worst crimes in the world. And I think when you look again back to this idea of justice, well, what is justice? Should we be looking to rehabilitate people who have committed crimes? Should we be trying to ensure those crimes don't happen again, not through threat, but through changing the conditions which led to the crime in the first place? So many of those minor crimes are because of the structure of society, inequalities, people not having opportunities, etc. You know, crime being an easier way to do certain things than the correct way, when we've got lots of, you know, problems with doing the correct way. So I guess my thought is, in terms of prison, is just saying we should be thinking, what is it we actually want to achieve? What is justice? Is it just locking people up and, you know, sweeping them under the rug and putting them in prison? Or is it making society safe? Or is it making society better for all of us so that crime isn't a more appealing outcome?
So I think we can all agree that that should be, that's a laudable set of outcomes. Francis, I'm just going to come back to you very quickly, because I know that you at the Howard League have done some work with police around trying to deal with that precise issue, really trying to stop kids getting arrested, right?
Yes, we started doing some work with the police when we discovered that there'd been 250,000 child arrests about 10 years ago. And it was because the Labour government put in place targets. And of course, it's very much easier to arrest a child for spray painting their name or stolen a Mars bar than to arrest the person who burgled my house, which they haven't done, I have to say. So we started working with the police then, and the success has been phenomenal. Of course, the targets were abolished, but even so, the culture was still there, and police felt, you know, getting a collar was a thing to do. Since then, the number of arrests has gone down by nearly 3/4. So and the number of children being arrested has gone right down, and that's great because child crime has gone down too. So this is a success for everybody. It means the police are not dealing with children. Children are not being so annoying. You know, well, teenagers are very challenging. We know that. You don't arrest them for being teenagers.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's a success story.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but can I just go back over that figure? Did you say that it was 250,000 arrests 10 years ago, and it's gone down by 3/4?
Yes.
That's amazing.
It's a massive reduction, and the number of young children who've been arrested is falling dramatically. And this means that all the way through the system, at the time, sort of 10 years ago, there were 3,500 children in prisons, and now there are about 600. So it's been a dramatic change. It shows it can be done, but it's the front end stuff. So in a sense, we're having the wrong conversation. We should be talking about the policing of people, because that's the gatekeeper.
Interesting.
That's where we stop people coming into the system. Of course, there are going to be people who've committed serious sexual offences, violence, rape. Yeah. Well, most rapists, of course, as we know, don't get caught. Or don't get prosecuted.
It's probably an overdue moment to just do the clarification to say it's much like when people talk about defunding the police. That doesn't mean abolishing the police. It means actually, how about you spend more money on education than you did on
absolutely.
Creating an occupying force in an urban area.
Fund health, libraries, education, and cut funding from the criminal justice system. It's called justice reinvestment. It's a technical phrase. You take investment from justice and reinvest it in the community.
I like it. And again, I mean, to be clear, I think no one is properly saying that violent offenders who pose a tremendous threat to society shouldn't be imprisoned. But I think what we mean by the posing of the question is really, there are a lot of people either on short sentences or not for non-violent offences, for whom it's not really serving anyone very well. I'm going to come back in a second, Summers, to you, but I'm just going to go on a brief detour to talk to Julia Anderson, if she's around. Are you there, Julia?
I am. I'm just going to. Hi. Yes.
Hey, how are you doing?
Fine.
And Julia, I'm right if I'm reading this correctly? You've worked in magistrates' courts, and you have a particular view on what happens with repeat low-level offenders.
Yes.
So what have you seen?
I think it's more of a question, really.
You know, I mean, try and reinvent it as a statement, if you can.
I shall try and reinvent it as a statement. I think I probably come at things from a very different angle to Dan, but I do agree with an awful lot of what he said. There is the really sticky issue of, and anyone who works in the criminal justice system sees this, the people who don't want to engage, they don't want to engage in restorative justice, they don't want to access support that's available, and they're repeatedly breaching their community orders. And so you find that the judge or the magistrates are left with the choice that what can we do when this person has repeatedly breached a community order, they get him to offend. We have no choice. We all know that short prison sentences don't work, and they are probably counterproductive in almost every case. But what is to be done when somebody, because I can probably see the tabloid headlines when someone's committed their 31st drunken disorderly offence and they're still on their 31st community order and are repeatedly breaching it. What is to be done there with this sort of case?
And so, yes, that is an open-ended question, isn't it? Well, let's try and engage with that if we can in the time that we still have. Summers, can I come to you? And I would really like to start talking about women in prison, because I mean, again, Francis has shown that, you know, the strides have been made when it comes to children in prison. Something I read in researching this, I'd been working in the US, and so I was not around in 2018 when the government did its strategy on dealing with female offenders. And I must say, I was shocked to read it in the last few days. And David Gork was Justice Secretary at the time, you know, Tory Justice Secretary, and he was one of the, I would say it's one of the most enlightened and thoughtful government reports I've ever seen, and it had a lot of solutions and was asking all of the right questions really about, you know, what was leading women to prison and what should and shouldn't be done. And of course, I mean, it's he's gone, Boris Johnson's here. I was reminded that Boris Johnson wrote in the Daily Telegraph around about the same time about our cockeyed, crook-coddling criminal justice system, and everything that he's done as Prime Minister has been about, you know, we're going to build more prisons, we're going to have more police officers, longer sentences, and it's the classic red meat for the tabloids, really. So let's have a think, Summers, about what are the characteristics of women in prison that make us feel many of them shouldn't be there in the first place?
Well, women are, I mean, we all know this, women are different from men, but women in prison, the characteristics of women, the population of women in prison is extremely different from that of men, yet they are both treated under this exact same system. Women are, the large majority of women come into prison because of substance misuse or domestic abuse, domestic violence. There's more than half of women in prison suffer with mental illness. Some of that is exacerbated or brought on through their dealings with the criminal justice system. But again, most women who are in prison are serving sentences for non-violent offenses. A lot of
key to this, isn't it?
Around 45% of women are serving sentences for crimes they committed to support someone else's drug habit. A lot of it is petty crime, you know, and these sentences are under 12 months, sometimes under 3 months. And that really doesn't serve any kind of, you know, rehabilitative purpose. What it ends up doing is really just disrupting women's lives. And, you know, women really thrive in a community setting. They need a support system, a family system in place. Oftentimes women are the sole caregiver for their children, and when they are sent to prison, their children then have to enter the system as well, and that, you know, causes more trauma and also more of a financial burden on the state. But that women who serve really short sentences have a very high reconviction rate, which tells you that, you know, there's nothing being done to rehabilitate, and prison is not a deterrent, that there is a more effective system to help them. And a lot of it is early intervention strategies, community intervention strategies to deal with the root causes, to deal with, you know, trauma. A lot of it is trauma-informed services that, you know, help women be better members of their society, of their community, and ultimately, you know, they don't want to reoffend. They want to have these strategies to get themselves out of this cycle. And it seems that it's more cost-effective, honestly, to give them that system than to incarcerate them.
I suppose this leads us to the question of, have you seen anything that works as an alternative that does prevent reoffending and is an alternative to breaking up a family, and is cost effective as well?
There are lots of things being done for gender specific needs to be met, and a lot of them, you know, community intervention, women's centers do incredible work, and unfortunately they're underutilized, but, you know, they do fantastic work.
Just go into a tiny bit more detail there. I mean, what do we understand by women's centres, and have I understood this correctly, that that they're more prevalent in Wales than they are in England, for instance?
I don't know the specific numbers on women's centers and their distribution, honestly, but you know, it's kind of, I'm not the only woman who feels that way, and many women who could benefit from women's centers don't know that they're available. They don't know what services could provide them, which, you know, they really do need kind of an injection of finance and innovation to meet the needs of women. There's now talk about residential units and how those can benefit women, and part of that is keeping families together while doing rehabilitation, and having more of a holistic approach.
That does seem key, doesn't it? The idea of keeping families together is, you know, is the bigger picture, isn't it? When you step back from someone who's committed, even if they're a nuisance and they're a persistent offender, you sort of feel keeping the family unit together is you know, if it's safe for the child, is more important.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And you know, we find that oftentimes separating a child from their mother causes the kind of trauma that starts this process, you know, enters this child into the criminal justice system, almost, that all of a sudden the cards are stacked against them. And, you know, that there should be work to be done on, you know, not just rehabilitating these women, but also offering services to their children. They are suffering from trauma as well, and how to give tools, you know, to really fix the family unit and address these underlying issues.
Thank you for that, Summers. So can I come to Susie Dale? There's so much there's so much ground to cover here. We haven't talked about the racial justice element of this at all, but it's right to say that you know, disproportionate numbers of people from BAME communities in both men's and women's prisons. And I think, Susie, you were flagging the Future Prison podcast, which you produced.
Yeah, sorry, I've not put the video on because the reception's not very good where we are in Northumberland. But
well,
yeah,
you're on a podcast.
Yeah, so I produced the Future Prison podcast for the Prison Radio Association, and we looked at 3 distinct groups: so young people in prison, women, and people from the Black, Asian, minority ethnic group in prison and their experiences. And we put them in conversation with representatives from the Ministry of Justice. And they had these brilliant conversations about what it was like recently for them in prison, all about their experiences, all about the little things and sometimes the big things that brought them to prison, and also what's gone on in their backgrounds. And also their experiences while they were in prison. So, for instance, we spoke to Victoria, whose podcast is out, I think it's next week, or it might have been last week actually. And she talks about just a simple thing like making food in prison, and it was mackerel, and other prisoners, white prisoners, unfortunately, were saying, you know, we don't like the smell of that. So she would be given IEPs, which are punishments for making the food that she liked as part of her culture in prison. So it was nuances and sometimes overt things that that these prisoners experienced, and that often the Ministry of Justice, senior members from the Ministry of Justice, didn't know or weren't aware of. So when she had a conversation with Tanya Robinson, who's head of diversity and inclusion at the Ministry of Justice, you know, Tanya just said, I wasn't aware of this, you know, I'm going to look into what's going on. You know, we had different conversations with the women, Kelly and Courtney, who experienced prison in style prison, and they both had different things that had gone on with them. You know, Courtney was 20 when she went to prison. She had a daughter, little access to education before she went to prison. And she said, you know, thank God I went to prison in some ways. You know, it was horrendous in lots of ways, but it gave me access to a better life.
Really?
You know, she had education opportunities. She doesn't have access to her daughter at the moment, but it's something she's hoping to get in the future. But it's, I think the struggle is when they then leave prison, and what kind of world are you going into? You know, there's often really good things in prison. I spent nearly 10 years working HMP Style, a women's prison in Cheshire, and there are some really good courses. But it's when you leave prison that, you know, that the cards are just stacked against you to try and get opportunities and get jobs when you leave.
Thank you so much for sharing all of that. And I can see that you've put a link to your podcast in the chat there, which no doubt people can spot for themselves. I'd be very grateful if you'd ping me some further details. It would be lovely to hear more of your work. I mean, you land on something which again sort of just made me so outraged. Earlier this year, we did this podcast, and there's a brilliant journalist called Audrey Gillen, who's a former Guardian journalist, and she's gone on and done amazing work on radio around homelessness. And we got her to do this piece that was sort of personal testimony. It was called 3 Women Homeless, and it really sort of it found all of the common threads of addiction and child abuse and domestic violence and all of that which underpinned these women's stories. But the thing that really sort of leapt out in the margins was this one woman called Tony, who had been to she'd been in and out of Bronzefield prison, and she, you know, her initial offence was a really sort of mundane one, but she'd been recalled on licence, she said 45 times, and I don't know if that was right. I mean, she certainly was a person who had addiction issues, but she reeled off in this interview the 15 days, 30 days, 45 days, you know, and she was getting called back and back because she was breaching the terms of her license. And the point was, she was homeless, she didn't have a phone, and there was no way she could get to a probation officer, even if she wanted to, not least because she had an addiction. And every time she came out of prison, her life was even more chaotic. And if I've understood this correctly, the first time you come out, at least you get a bit of money in your pocket to get you started. But if you come out on license, you're just basically sent out the gate and that's it. And so, you know, what happens next is further chaos, I suppose. All of which leads us to the, goodness me, the 5-minute mark. We've got 5 minutes to go. So I would just like, if I could, to whiz round our guests one more time, if I could. And can I just ask you to, you know, after all of the talk of a broken system and such like, my question to you is, how do we cause good trouble? What should we be flagging? Whose story should we tell? What's the human story that reveals the systemic ill and the injustice? I'm going to throw that one to you first, Frances, and go on. 30 seconds to solve it all.
Very, very quickly, can I respond to 2 things, which I think I keep referring to research, but David Gore published research, which is still available on the Ministry of Justice website, which shows that the short sentence people, the people who are chaotic and annoying and who repeat offend, it's much better if you do keep giving them community sentences, because like for like, if you send them to prison, it makes things worse. That's the Ministry of Justice own research. So if magistrates would stop sending people to prison for short sentences, the world would be a better place. And that's what the Ministry of Justice research shows. So that's one thing that could change. The other thing that, again, I like glimmers of hope. I like good news stories. And the good news stories is women's centres. The thing about a women's centre, it's a place, it's a building. It's somewhere to go. It's somewhere safe. It's somewhere run by women for women. It's a building, which is really important. And they're all different. There are about 50 around the country. They're all different. But basically what they have is they have cook clubs, they have washing machines, there's somewhere to leave your kids. They'll sort out your rent. They'll sort out your domestic violence problem. They'll help you with your CV to get a job. Whatever it is you want, they rapidly give you a big hug, which doesn't happen in the criminal justice. And now, that's lovely, and that works. And again, research shows that it helps individual women.
And have I understood this correctly, that as it's open as part of a community sentence to instruct women to have to attend?
Yes, it is partly, but you'll find also it helps other women who are not just on justice systems, but also perhaps women get referred there with help for domestic violence, or so they're victims as well. So a women's centre can be a mixture of services provided for women, not just women in the criminal justice system. But there's nothing like it for men. That's the problem.
Well, I tell you what,
so men need to learn from women, as in so much in life.
Always. And well, with that in mind, Vicky, what have you got? What's your solution for men?
Well, I'm going to say this, but we deliver coaching. What's special about coaching is it respects that young person is an expert in their own life, and actually within them, they will have some solutions. They will know what it is that will stop them offending. They will know what it is that will give them the motivation to stay away from crime. So it's a really respectful way of working with young people, and it's used in professional settings, and we have some of the best coaches who train leaders in business one day, and then the next day they're in Feltham sitting opposite a young man and giving him the best coaching they can give, and it's powerful.
And that could take place outside of the confines of a prison setting, right?
Yes, and we do that as well. So we are starting to coach in the community, because we also, obviously, our passion is about stopping young people ending up in prison as well.
So it sounds like we need to pay a visit to a women's centre, and we need to see some coaching in action, for sure. Summers, what would you like to close with? What's your magic bullet, if such a thing exists?
Well, I think that one of the first ways to really start making change is to start changing the way that we talk. And I'm going to speak specifically to women, but start changing the way that we talk about women who are living with conviction, women in the criminal justice system. That I think that generally you assume that because someone has been convicted of a crime that they are somehow, a violent criminal. They're a threat to society, to their own safety, to other safeties, and that's generally not the case at all. So I think, exploring the complexities of women and the underlying factors that contribute to offending really helps show the entire story and show how the system isn't working for them, but ways that the system really could easily be changed to help them. You know, that generally our kind of slogan is care, not cages, that is generally what women need is care and support. And, you know, that they are complex, interesting, creative people, just like, you know, any of us are. And somewhere along the way, they made a bad decision.
Summers, thank you for that, and I'm sorry to truncate that, but we're right on the whistle. It sort of falls to me just to try and sum up a little bit. It's very striking to hear Frances talking about what frightening, awful places prisons are, and how, you know, somehow COVID was seen as a brief moment of respite from the violence. You know, again, you know, to hear Vicky talking about a broken system, and yet within it, brilliant staff and brilliant young people who want to change their lives is wrenching. And again, to hear Summers talk about all of the problems that the women have in their lives before they get to the gates of the prison, and how very little is done to address the whole set of issues, and you know, the ongoing cost that goes to the impact on families too. It struck me in both the conversation and in my research, really, that you know, that short sentences are quite disastrous for individuals and for society, really. And if as Frances was saying, you know, David Gork is there on the record as making clear that the evidence is there, and that indeed you should follow the evidence, rather than you know, curry favor with the tabloids. That would be a start from a political point of view. But if the purpose of this really is for us to try and look at the next direction of our journalism, there's no escape from the need to tell individual stories. And I do feel that in the spheres that you've described, the things that have fascinated me have included, you know, the obvious success story of massively reducing the arrests of young people. That seems like something we should celebrate and talk about. Women's centres, I think we certainly need to engage with, and again with the coaching which Vicky's described. So I think there's a lot for us to go at, but you know, the starting point for me is that it's baffling that we lock up so many people. And that addiction to punishment line is the one that's going to stay with me, along with a couple of other phrases of the night. Proportionate revenge was one too. So it's an incomplete process, but I really believe we're on the road to something. And I hope that if any of you didn't get a chance to ask a question, I'm apologising to Mary and Hugh in particular, whose hands I can see are still up. Please email. It's david@tortoisemedia.com if you want to send direct to me, or my colleague Claudia will no doubt put her email in the chat. Let's keep the conversation going, and let's keep the ideas flowing. And I'd love to talk to all three of our guests again as we go forward, because I'm sure we can do good work together. So once again, here I am in splendid isolation, but I feel like I've had a great coming together with you tonight, and I really appreciate you all joining the conversation. I've learned a lot, and I think it will help shape our journalism. So all we can do is wave each other off. We can't give each other a hug, much as we'd like to, but thanks so much for joining.